So greetings and welcome this evening. My name is Andrew Mangels and I'm the director of Westlake Board of Public Library, and I thank you for coming this evening. The library's mission is to provide an inclusive environment that fosters learning, community growth, and connection in an ever-changing world. So when I was approached by a Westlake resident, my friend Issam Zayam, about offering a program on Palestine and Israel, I felt like in order to live our mission, we needed to explore this possibility. Issam introduced me to our speaker, Dr. Moore, and we agreed that presenting a program that focused on the history of the region could be beneficial to better understanding. And while our program this evening is a political and historical survey and not intended to explore or debate the current war taking place, we would be remiss in not taking a moment of silence in recognition of all those who have perished, been displaced, and are suffering, as well as hold a fervent hope for peace. Thank you. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Pete Moore. Dr. Moore is the M.A. Hanna Associate Professor of Politics at Case Western Reserve University and has a B.A. from Virginia Military Institute, an M.A. from the University of Virginia, and a Ph.D. from McGill University. Dr. Moore's research interests focus on economic development and state-society relations in the Middle East and Africa, specifically Gulf Arab states and Levant, business-state relations, privatization, and decentralization, sub-state conflict, and regional security. Professor Moore currently serves on the Editorial Committee of the Middle East Report and is a member of the Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle East Studies. We're extremely grateful for Dr. Moore for joining us this evening as he came all the way across the river from the east side to present this program for you this evening. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much. I'm very not real happy to be here, but I'm honored to be here in the sense that what brings me here is a significant, greatest humanitarian crisis of the 21st century. But I want to give you a little bit of background to let you know sort of where I'm coming from. Also, I'm not going to be able to answer all questions. I'm not going to cover all aspects about this conflict or about politics in the Middle East, but I wanted to let you know a little bit. So I am a political science professor. I've been at Case since 2005. Most of my work is focused on other parts of the Arab world, so I'm lucky and privileged. I get to go to Jordan, the Gulf states a lot. I do kind of boring academic work, but it does intersect with issues of conflict as well as U.S. foreign policy and the current international sort of aspect of Middle East politics. I'm not an ancient historian. You know, one of the problems of political science is we kind of think history started right after World War II. But when I teach my Introduction to Middle East Politics or upper level courses, we do start in the 19th century. So end of the Ottoman Empire up through the 20th and 21st centuries. Ancient history, I'm not well versed in. I'm also not a scholar of religious studies. From the perspective of a social scientist, a political scientist, the conflict between Israel and Palestine, the larger Arab-Israeli conflict, is a political conflict. It's a modern conflict. While religious, either groups, individuals, can be attached to this conflict, be aggravated about this conflict. Ultimately, this is a conflict that shares similarities and differences with others in the global south. And in kind of an odd, sort of optimistic way, it's a political conflict. Therefore, ultimately, it has political solutions. What else can I say? I can talk about, as we get into this, what I want to present is something that's sort of narrow, but at the end, try to branch out. So the title of this is trying to put Gaza in historical and political context. Small part of the world. But I want to put it in historical and political context and bring it up to today so that you can see some of the larger linkages with Gaza in the region, but also internationally. and also to give us a better understanding about not just sort of high politics up here, diplomacy, states, although this is important, but also to understand sort of more local political dynamics, because this is a conflict in which both of these sort of peoples are co-located and can't move, right? So the histories of both, in a sense, are tied to one another. So with that, let me get started. I'm going to start, again, slightly after World War II. Gaza is today a place of about 2.3 million Palestinians. About 85% of that population are refugees. Most of them fled the surrounding areas from what we call Gaza now, small villages and small towns around that area. They fled or were expelled in 1948. This is what the Israelis call the War of Independence, what Palestinians call the catastrophe. What's important about Gaza, if we move a little bit before 1948, Gaza is a rural area. It's primarily agricultural and fishing. Compared to the urban areas, the urban Palestinian centers of the north, yeah, Gaza's rural, but it's not backward. It's conservative, comparatively, with the rest of sort of Palestinian urban areas. But of course, in 1948, it will be a place in which a large number of Palestinian refugees will flee. And there's a couple of important things as well about the 1948 war when we talk about this new Israeli state and a larger Palestinian movement. In the social sciences, we look at things like Zionism, or what can be termed Palestinian nationalism, as forms of political projects, nationalism. And we sort of define nationalism as this desire, a political project, to have the borders of a state match the borders of a nation. But of course, if you try to unpack what you think American nationalism is, we're going to have a fun conversation, right? Like, what nation? What particular state borders? So all forms of nationalism, Zionism included, have dilemmas, have political dilemmas. And in 1948, there's two big dilemmas in these two national movements. One of the basic dilemmas of the Zionist project is a desire to have the land, but not the people, right? And this is going to be a perennial problem. It's not the only thing that's going to inform Israeli politics towards the Palestinians, but arguably this dilemma of wanting the land but not the people is going to inform a lot of Israeli policies towards the Palestinians. And in the Palestinian sort of national movement, there's similar dilemmas. How do you pull together a nation of refugees now that are spread from Syria to Lebanon to Jordan, smaller numbers in Egypt, and then large refugee populations in the West Bank and Gaza? How do you create a national movement out of that? And then, what's the most effective form of resistance when the war was over in 48? So both of these movements are beset with dilemmas. After 1948 until 1967, Gaza is a pretty important place. One of the first things that begins to happen, both in the West Bank and Gaza, is that those refugees that fled are going to attempt to come back home, right? And particularly along the Gaza border, this is going to get very violent, right? You're going to start to see border conflict as refugees try to sneak back. The Israeli military is not going to allow refugees to go back. And Gaza is really going to be, in this period, a hotbed of Palestinian resistance. But it's not just Gaza important in this sort of embryonic Palestinian community after 48, but Gaza really becomes important internationally. The founders of the Black Panthers visit Gaza and model themselves after the Palestinian guerrillas that called themselves the Fedayeen. Malcolm X visits, Che Guevara. They all go to Gaza. Gaza arguably becomes sort of this inspirational place for many global South revolutionary movements from Algeria, to the Caribbean. And I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to draw a straight line from Gaza to movements like Black Lives Matter today in the US and other similar movements. Of course, in 1967, what the Israelis call the Six-Day War, Arabs call 67 War, State of Israel will conquer Golan, West Bank, Gaza, Sinai. So one thing is, remember that dilemma, right, of land and people? This is going to become even more acute now for the Israelis because they've conquered more land, but that land comes with a lot of Palestinians. One of the first initial sort of Israeli occupation policies, or the policies the Israelis will adopt once they come in to control Gaza and the West Bank, according to an Israeli political scientist, Neve Gordon, he argues that initial Israeli policies were designed to make the occupation invisible, right? So you got to recall, this is 1967. I see some of you in this room would realize what the political environment was then. The United States is deeply involved in the Vietnamese War, right? The United States not only has not an invisible occupation, 500,000 American troops, the American flag, all over South Vietnam. The Israeli military and political elite are thinking comparatively. And the idea is, and this comes from Moshe Dayan and the sort of the Israeli general elite, is to not do what the Americans are doing. Make the occupation invisible in ways that will get Palestinians to focus on other things instead of forms of political opposition. And so the Israelis adopt a lot of policies from 67 through the 80s that can be termed sort of uplifting. And what this means is they will allow the building of universities in Gaza, the universities in the West Bank. I guess one of the things I left out is that one of the first places I studied Arabic was at Birzeit University sort of in the early 90s. So while my research is not on Israel-Palestine, I do have a lot of colleagues and friends there. And so a place like Birzeit University was built in this period. So the Israeli objective here is sort of uplifting to sort of, keep Palestinian attention elsewhere. And one of the most important policies is Israel will begin allowing in a lot of day laborers, particularly from Gaza. And the idea is, and it will peak in the 1980s, you're talking hundreds of thousands of Palestinians will cross the border and work in Israel. And the logic here is that if Palestinians are working, they're focused on working, they're focused on, the everyday bread and butter of life, and they're going to not focus on things like the occupation. Of course, the problem here is that while the Israelis are uplifting over here in the 70s and 80s, over here they're increasing settlement activity, so that the original settlements that will begin to appear in the 60s begin by the 70s to become different types of settlements. The settlements gets larger, and so you're beginning to see, I guess, the more, as Neve Gordon says it, the more coercive parts of the occupation begin to clash with that uplifting. And in 1986, you get the outbreak of the first Intifada. Not what congressmen term whatever some of our congressmen mispronounce that term. The Intifada is not a particularly Palestinian term. It means uprising or shuffling off. There's been many Intifadas in the Arab world historically. This one, though, in 1987, the Intifada is associated with a Palestinian uprising. It's very much organic. It's surprising. It starts in Gaza, in the place called Rafah. This is the southern part of Gaza, where most of those Palestinian refugees now have relocated. And it spreads rapidly through the West Bank and Gaza. Primarily, it's nonviolent. Nonviolent here meaning broken bones, rocks, rubber bullets, compared to the second Intifada, which will be far more bloody, far more violent. But what's important about this uprising is a few things. Number one, as I said, it's unplanned, it's organic, it spreads very quickly. No one at this point, and I'm going to describe a little bit of the Palestinian political apparatus and then switch to the Israelis. There was no Palestinian opposition that predicted this, and the Israelis themselves were very surprised. In this period in 1987, you see the birth of what is called the Islamic Resistance Movement of Palestine. So this is the acronym Hamas. It is created in 87. It's created in Gaza. It's an offshoot of an older, a few decades old, social welfare organization that had been in place since Egypt controlled Gaza. But Hamas is different. Its immediate political opponent, it is opposed to the Israelis, of course. It's trying to catch up to that Intifada, right? It's seeing this take off, and like other Palestinian factions, it wants to be seen as a leader, so it's trying to catch up to that. But Hamas is much smaller, much weaker in this period. its main political opponent in this period is Yasser Arafat's Fatah movement. Arafat, he's in Tunisia. Much of the Fatah movement, its leadership, its money, is not in Gaza and the West Bank. It's outside this area. So you have the birth of a inside, if you will, inside the Palestinian communities under occupation. You have the growth of this movement. It's opposed to this other very large, far more powerful, far more popular Palestinian movement led by Yasser Arafat. The last element about the Intifada that's important to understand for this conflict is that, as I mentioned, Israeli policy up until this point was much different. It was predicated on, look, we can handle this. The Palestinians are acquiesced, they're placated, everything is fine. Suddenly, the Intifada breaks out. They're caught by surprise. And early on, Israeli authorities will, and this is not a conspiracy theory, will passively or look the other way while Hamas gets organized. Why? Hamas is opposed to what the Israelis at the time saw was their implacable enemy, Yasser Arafat. And so standard divide and rule, allow this thing to take root, look the other way, as a way to counterbalance Arafat. And so sort of the political theme here is Hamas is, in part, it's a product of this conflict, right? It emerges in 1987. As a result of this intifada, like I said, it has these huge effects all across the globe, particularly in the United States. This is also the period after the American liberation of Kuwait, first Bush administration wanting to pay back its Arab allies. A lot of people forget that the Syrians actually sent military to help the Americans liberate Kuwait. So in the midst of all of this, as a result partially of the Intifada, we're going to get what's called the Oslo peace process, right? This is initiated by the Bush administration. It really dies in 2000 under the Clinton administration. And we can talk in question and answer about what killed Oslo, what was going on, but essentially Oslo ends up not being so much of a peace process based on a two-state solution, but it becomes a form of conflict management, right? Because what will begin to happen is the Israeli authorities will be able to hold on to most of the settlements through the Oslo process, but the Palestinians, and this is how Arafat and Fatah come back into Gaza and the West Bank, are allowed to create this interim, non-state, but sort of authority. It's called the Palestinian Authority. So in a way, and this is again sort of an argument that you see from people like Neve Gordon and other Israeli historians, the Israelis were able to sort of outsource the day-to-day expensive parts of the occupation to this Palestinian Authority, which was meant to be temporary as a place setter for negotiations. But as I said, by 2000 the peace process will die, but it's going to die over a series of steps in the 1990s. So one of the first things that begins to happen in the wake of that first intifada, as the peace process is beginning to take hold, in 1991, the Israelis now realize that these previous policies of uplifting did not get them what they wanted, and they'll start withdrawing many of these daily work permits. So today, or before October 7th, Gaza, you could compare Gaza to Haiti, to Yemen, to Somalia. These were some of the poorest areas in that part of Asia. But Gaza, that poverty, and thank you, that poverty was not, forever and ever and ever. It really begins we began to see it in 1991. Because Gaza labor was so dependent on that day work in Israel that once the Israelis start pulling back the day permits, this is when you start to see in UN statistics the beginning of the decline of the Gazan economy. So this is in 1991. In 1993, Israel completely cuts off Gaza. So today, or before October, Israel, or Gaza could be referred to as under siege. In 1993, Israel cuts it off completely. So I only visited Gaza once when I was at Birzeit, visited in '92. You could take a bus from Ramallah. It was a long drive, but you could go straight in. Went to Gaza City and kind of visited the beach and kind of stuff like that. But after '93, you needed a permit. You needed a permit to leave or a permit to go in. And so these permits are very hard to get, especially If you don't have, like, if you're just going there just to hang out or to see people, you have to have a real reason. So in 91, you get the workers replaced. In 93, Gaza is completely cut off. And it's in April 1994 that we see the first suicide bombing from Hamas. And this is in response to the killing of a number of Palestinian worshippers at the Ibrahimi Mosque in the city of Hebron. It's a very, very famous mosque and synagogue. It was a terrible killing there. And in response, they launched their first suicide bombing in 94. So 87, 91, 93, 94. Things will start to happen very fast. 1996, Benjamin Netanyahu, first time he's elected prime minister. He's elected with a very similar political platform to Hamas. Complete rejection of the Oslo peace process, complete rejection of the two-state system, right, the two-state solution, and an advocate of continuing to use violence. And again, the political opponent is still Yasser Arafat, not as powerful as he was in 87, but still powerful. Arafat is fully invested in the Oslo peace process, while Hamas is standing back and Netanyahu are standing back. And as the peace process begins to fail, both sides can say, see, we told you this was going to fail. The second intifada launches quickly after the failure of Camp David in 2000. Second intifada, far more brutal. In March 2001, Hamas will launch its first mortar, not a rocket, its first mortar in March of 2001 from Gaza into Israel. In 2005 and 2006, at this point, Ariel Sharon is the prime minister. He pulls about 5,000 to 6,000 Israeli settlers out of Gaza. Many of them are redeployed to the West Bank. And this is the beginning of the full cutoff of Gaza. But we have a few other important things that happen very quickly. Also, we're now in the second Bush administration. We've got to go through these American political families, right? This is like, I go to monarchies all the time. I'm very comfortable in monarchies. I just find our monarchy, the most interesting. So we're in the second dynasty of the Bush family. And again, this is the Bush family feeling what? Pressure, invasion of Iraq, desire to spread democracy around the world. And the Bush administration will push elections on the Palestinian Authority in 2006. Arafat doesn't want to have elections, feels he has to go through with it. The Israelis were uneasy about these elections. Hamas had boycotted the original elections, right? Complete rejectionist. They decide to participate in the elections in 2006. No one believed that they would do very well, and I don't think Hamas thought they would do very well. And owing to some pretty silly electoral mistakes on the part of Yasser Arafat's Fatah movement, Hamas wins not a majority, a plurality, to this thing called sort of the Palestinian Authority. It's like a parliament. However, the Americans and the Israelis quickly annul the elections, will not allow a government to be formed because you have to go from Gaza to the West Bank and create the government. The Israelis and the Americans will not allow this government to take place. They cut it off. Then in 2007, Hamas launches what can be considered a soft coup d'etat to what was left of the Fatah administration in Gaza. And it's at that point in 2007 when the Israelis put in place that thing we call the siege, complete land, air, and sea blockade. And we see a number, about almost a dozen named Israeli IDF military campaigns into the Gaza Strip at this time. Not just Hamas, but other smaller groups will launch rockets now, not just mortars, into Israel. And in this period, I think three important things. This is really like a 17-year period until we get to the events of last October. But, you know, it's kind of hard to remember that time before, but, you know, this was a period where this was, both by American and Israeli officials, looked at as the most sophisticated, highly surveillanced part of the world to rival the demilitarized zone in between North and South Korea. In this period, we get terms like mowing the grass. Remember where the Israelis have moved from. From this policy of uplift, we're going to uplift, they're going to get them to forget about the occupation, to mowing the grass. And mowing the grass is this IDF term to mean that, well, every once in a while, you have to go into Gaza, you have to cut off a lot of Hamas, kill, destroy infrastructure, whatever you can, kind of mow that grass down, and then eventually they'll get organized, they'll come back up and we'll do the same thing again. So you have this very sort of very confident policy that both the US and the Israelis are projecting in this period. And the political effect really is, up until October, you know, Palestine's not an important issue. If you're Joe Biden, you remember what Obama did in the beginning when he became president, trying to put pressure on the Israelis. It doesn't pay off. The Palestinians are contained. The occupation is easy. And, you know, Gaza is a cage, but it's contained. And on October 7th, of course, a lot of those politics were pulled down. The scale of the Hamas attack, the brutality, the number of killings in a single day were shocking in terms of this conflict. 800 Israeli civilians, 36 children under the age of 18, 370 soldiers were killed. Another 250 were taken hostage. Around half of the Israeli civilian death toll came from the attack on that music festival. Since that day, the IDF has killed over 20 times that number of Palestinians, 200 times as many children. We have 100,000 casualties. That's dead and wounded. This is the highest death toll among Palestinians in this conflict. Globally, this is the fastest military killing of civilians, whether one thinks it's justified or not, compared to the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Well, what are Israel's goals? Stated clearly, the Israeli goals are the destruction and elimination of Hamas, its infrastructure, its leadership. This goal is highly doubtful on October 8th, and it's less believable today. Movements like Hamas, we could talk about what we want to compare it to, what it's similar to, what it's not. But it's a political movement. And movements like this, you know, as I said, Hamas in itself is a product of this conflict. The more controversial elements of Israeli goals are less stated. Much of the international community, some scholars that look at this conflict argue that the Israeli objectives are larger, and they're essentially to make Gaza unfit for human life, right? Either to turn, so I'm born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, and the state of Georgia, you know, was home to the Cherokee. And I think for some scholars, what Israeli policy, the unstated component of it is, to try to solve this problem in their view by turning the Palestinians into Native Americans. I don't think that's a stark conclusion. It's a troubling one. And at this point, where we are in this conflict, I can't, you know, say where it's headed, but I think and this is where I'll just kind of conclude, the broader ramifications we could talk about in American society. I have not seen, I was teaching at the University of Miami in Florida when 9/11 hit. I was teaching my intro to Middle East politics that started on Monday after this attack. And this in some ways reminds me of 9/11, but in other ways it doesn't, because in the lead up to the US invasion of Iraq, it was pretty clear what was going to happen to the US invasion. Same thing that happened to the Vietnamese invasion and all the other ones, we were eventually going to leave. This one is harder to see, but I think the effects on American society are serious. I think they're lasting. We can talk about what's going on American campuses. I think that's extremely important, not just in a generational sense, but also in how we see our universities. In the region itself, and this is where I think there's not enough coverage, we can talk about, and I think that the American media has a good grasp of the effects of this on Israeli society, you know, the catastrophic effects on this for Israelis. I think we have a less grasp of about what the effects of this are on Palestinian society, and I think that's very important going forward. Jordan, Lebanon, the other Arab countries, Egypt, the political tensions today are very reminiscent of 2011 and other periods where it's very clear that the division between these Arab regimes, so not just my favorite monarchies, but the presidencies, the Abdel Fattah el-Sisi's, the FLN in Algeria, the ruling families of the Gulf. The gap between these regimes and their populations on this issue is similar to many other issues where there's a big gap. And so I think one of the regional effects here is that we're going to begin to see, again, the types of political mobilizations in the Arab world that tried to challenge power in 2011 and failed, were defeated. But this type of political conflict, the longer it goes on, the longer those movements in these countries will become more agitated. So I think in the region we have a huge effect. I think in the US we have a huge effect. And I think globally, we don't know where this is going. What we see is we see the United States working in lockstep with Israel, right? Very, very close. But what we're not paying attention to is Brazil, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Indonesia, South Africa, right? The vast majority of the global South. How do they see this conflict? What does this mean for future American leadership in the world? Because one of the things I think that this is exposed, and this has been exposed more than once, but many of these highly lofty ideals around human rights, around responsibility to protect. Someone like Samantha Power, the current head of our USAID, wrote one of the most impactful books on genocide, right? And the thesis of her book, called A Problem Out of Hell, A Problem from Hell, was that from the Armenian genocide, through the Holocaust, through the killing fields of Cambodia, through Rwanda, at every point in this book, she shows that European and later American political officials knew full well that genocide was occurring and didn't do anything. And what is so sad is to have someone like Samantha Power write in that book that all we had to do in Rwanda was to say, to call it genocide, because she interviewed Bill Clinton and he said, "What's my greatest regret? I didn't call it genocide." And yet Samantha Power writes that book, and she's head of USAID, which is the main, humanitarian arm of the US government. And so I think at the international level, this is going to be profound in terms of moving forward and sort of thinking about how the United States works in a world where clearly the values that it holds, are not the interests that it has. So on that point, I'm going to stop. And again, I'm happy to try to take all questions, but some things, obviously, I don't have too much insight, or I'll try to give you what I understand to be the broader literature on some of these questions, perhaps. So thank you very much. You just want to, how do you want to do it? You want to do microphones and stuff?
Ask your questions, we can have microphones so everybody can hear.
For me, it seems like Israel never wants to come to the table to discuss a two-country solution. And I find this analogous to when Sadat went into Sinai to bring Israel to the table to work on the peace process then. Don't you think Hamas has tried everything, and this is what they ended up doing to try and get Israel to the table?
Yeah, that's a tough question. So there's a good book by a guy named Nathan Thrall that says The Only Language They Understand. And he makes a very good argument that in this crisis, in this conflict between Israel and Palestine, the only way that you get movement forward is after some sort of disaster, some sort of pressure, some sort of constraint, I think it's an open question as to what the political goals of that part of the Hamas leadership that decided this was a good idea. We simply don't know yet, right? We know that it was the military wing that took this on. That's that inside leadership that I talked about. So a guy like Mohammed Deif, who was one of the people involved in this, he starts out very early on in the 80s, and now he's risen to a higher. But we simply don't know. Right after, if you go to the New Yorker on October 8th or 9th, there's an interview by Nathan Thrall, sort of getting his immediate reaction, and I think it's worth reading. And he almost argued that, in a sense, the Hamas decision was almost suicidal. Like, on October 8th, everybody knew, anybody that knew, any scholar or any journalist or anybody that spent any time looking at this conflict knew that what was coming after that attack, unfortunately, this is not unpredictable. This level of Okay, but the larger question is like this two-state problem. I think it is accurate to say that, particularly at Camp David, but before, that no Israeli leader has ever offered a fully sovereign, if we're talking about a two-state solution, has ever offered a fully sovereign state. You know, like there's an old international relations theorist that kind of argued, you know, sovereignty is like pregnancy. Either you are or you're not, right? So I think it is accurate to say that. But it is also accurate to say that Yasser Arafat never could come back with an offer. Particularly by 2000, he was very nervous of Clinton, because we all remember back. This was Clinton's swan song. He was going to get the Nobel Prize for this. He wasn't going to be reelected. Ehud Barak goes into Camp David definitely looking at reelection. Arafat's in neither of these situations. And so some of the literature does focus on bad leadership from, you know, Arafat's position. But keeping in mind, these two actors, the PA and the Israelis, they're not equal, right? And we know that in the peace negotiations, Aaron David Miller, who's a local and will be here at the City Club, he coined this phrase, I believe, Israel's lawyer, to describe the American negotiating team, because there was a rule, it's called the no surprise rule, which meant that any idea the Americans had about the peace process had to first be vetted with the Israelis before the Americans brought it to the table. So I think there were a lot of problems all the way around the two-state solution, but I have to say we still don't know what precisely the political motivations or goals on the Hamas side. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. It's to destroy the relationship, the Abraham Accords, other stuff like that. But you know, you take what political leaders say, you take it at face value, but then you investigate it. And right now, we don't have other ways of investigating statements that, you know, come from them. So, oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to pick? It's easier for you to go around. Yeah.
But we want to make sure everybody hears the questions, and then we'll come back. We'll go here, and then we'll come back here. Okay.
No problem. Thank you, Professor. That was 30 minutes of putting a lot of history without a lot of detail. You know. So, but you know, my question is, we as Americans have lost credibility in the Middle East, 100%. Our hypocrisy is on display every day. We opposed the occupation in Ukraine, but we allowed the occupation in Palestine. We free Kuwait to give it back to one family, so we don't allow democracy only when it suits us, and on and on and on. Haiti and Africa, we call it apartheid, and we can free Africa, but we won't call it apartheid when it's on full display in Palestine. The settlements issues, on and on and on. We can go forever and say, yeah, we made mistakes with the Native Indians, but we can see history repeating itself. We obviously have lost all credibility to be a peace broker. But yet, you know, the occupation will continue to persist. The two-state solution will never come to fruition as long as the U.S. is supporting Israel, and as long as there's a big, huge AIPAC influence on our Congress. So who do you see as the next fair broker in the world that can actually bring this to somewhere of a solution or peace? You've mentioned at the end talking about the popcorn effect, where the populations in the Arab world are about to pop, right? Yeah. Because there's no middle class anymore. You got the wealthiest of the wealthiest, you know, Saudis building a $150 billion city.
You know, they downgraded that one pretty fast.
Yeah, annihilating a whole population next to the Red Sea to do that. Nobody mentions those people because they don't matter, right? They're colored. But this is where we are right now in the world. We are completely lost credibility. So who's next? Who can next come as a peaceful broker in the world? Because we continue to say we are the police, but we're not.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the more optimistic side, before October 7th, there's no dearth of plans, right? I mean, like I said, I mean, as long as this conflict is not negotiated as some sort of religious conflict, we have to make divisions in religion or, you know, language divisions. Those are very hard. So there's plenty of roadmaps, you know, confederations, forms of joint custodianship, things like that. But of course, as you said, there was no political will, you know, for that. I'm at a loss because, I mean, I think that clearly these two parties, and particularly in the context of this horrendous violence, there's no way they're going to be able, and we should not, and I think part of what might change at the global level is this idea that, like, no, you may not, this is now a global issue, and you cannot treat it as an interstate conflict in which the Americans sort of officiate this thing unfairly. But I don't think that we can hope for some other global hegemon to come in and do it. I think this has to be truly an international effort, both in the way that, you know, it forces constraints on these actors, but then is able to offer them a light at the end of the tunnel for that constraint, right? And I think that's part of the American problem. We're good with the constraint. We're just not good at, like, there's the end of the tunnel, right? So I think a lot of the things you hear today about the US recognizing sort of this juridical stuff, I think that's not what needs to be done, right? I think declaring Palestine a state or making these juridical things or putting an embassy here or there sort of is a way for political elites to say they've done something and walk away. I think you need real international commitment. It's going to have peace observers, right? You're going to have objective observers. You're going to have, and this is the last thing, and I think this is extremely difficult, and why constraint has to be involved. But part of the problem is whenever we talk about security, or when Biden and the US administration talks about security, they do mean 100% security for Israel. Absolutely not one. It's like the Dick Cheney thing about if there's 1% a chance that Iraq has a nuclear weapon, we've got to go in there, right? And so this scholar, Dirk Moses, calls this absolute security. You can't, that's not a recipe for anything, right? And it's not a recipe for how to run the city of Cleveland. It's not. So that is to get the Israeli population, or to get the Palestinian population in a position where they're going to entertain, you know, some serious concessions. You're going to have much larger international work with this, but that's easier said than done.
Earlier, you were talking about other countries in the global south and their take on what's going on. Can you speak a little bit about that? Because you're right, I'm not paying any attention to it.
Yeah, so I have a colleague that works on India, and that would be a great one to talk about, but I can't really, I'm not that good on India. I mean, I think you have a political elite in India, and then you have, you know, it's a big country, so I'm going to have to leave a little bit of South Asia out of it. But I think what the South Africans did is part, you know, all of these things are political gestures, right? So it's a little bit of internal South African politics, but it's a move, and I mean South Africa bringing the genocide charges in The Hague. It's a move that has very broad political support because of the historical connections between the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and the Palestinian movement. So I think that's one area, large parts of Africa. I think that Brazil is also an interesting case. I mean, again, the current president of Brazil definitely is not a friend of American foreign policy, but I think you're seeing that this issue can be, you know, quite evocative in those parts of Latin America. And then the part of the world that I know better, I mean, part of the tension that's going on in Jordan, which is a country, you know, which is right next door, which has a large part of its population that originated in the Palestinian towns and villages, is that the regime is very good at keeping the lid on. I mean, they really are. And I don't think there's any chance that you're going to see a mobilized protest that, you know, is going to overcome that resistance. But what happens is that kind of political energy gets transferred to something else, right? And I think that's where you can see sort of unforeseen events that occur that at first don't seem connected to this conflict, but get retranslated into the domestic politics. I think Egypt right now, the regime in Egypt is extremely worried this will be transmitted into Egyptian politics, not as about Palestine, but about why are you not doing anything about Palestine? So I think the impacts are pretty clear, but like the effects are going to go in multiple directions. It's not quite clear.
Yes, I just wanted to ask you about, a lot of politicians now use the two-state solutions as a solution that they are anticipating. And I don't understand how they continue to address that issue while, the American policy have put ignored that issue, allowing Israel to build more settlements, and now at the present time, there are more settlements than ever before. So how could there be a two-state solution if the settlements are taken over the West Bank?
Yeah.
From my own perspective, I think it's going to be a one-state solution where both people are going to have to find a way to get along with each other, live side by side from the river to the sea. And it's like we live in here. We get along with each other. That's fine. They should do that too. But that's going to be a very obstacle for Israel to accept, to have a federation or some sort of a connection with the Palestinians, and not to call it a Jewish state.
Yeah.
So how do you perceive how we go from here?
Right. So the debate about the two-state versus one-state, this predates last year. A colleague at the University of Pennsylvania, Ian Lustig, wrote this piece in the New York Times about 8 years ago, and he called it the two-state illusion, right? And the argument in that sense is that, in other words, you start out by asking, why do American politicians sort of cling to the two-state solution? Because in a way, the two-state solution, saying you're going after it, sort of sets the agenda, and it moves other options off the table, some sort of confederation, one state, shared sovereignty, Netherlands, Belgium, something like that. But it also serves a very important role within U.S. politics, because it at least gives, because the two-state solution is something that the U.S. already agreed to, even if we can ignore that Netanyahu and large parts of the political elite in Israel now reject it. It still serves a purpose within the American foreign policy establishment, because if we say we're still for the two-state solution, then everything we did before is not wrong. We just need to tweak it a little bit for it to get right. And in the short term, it alleviates all the messiness of having to say what another option might be. And so I think that's one reason that it's so that within the political elite in the U.S. that it has sticking power, even though I agree with you, most analysts, so my colleagues, there's a text that came out last year before this called The One-State Reality. So this was a whole group of our best political scientists who work on the Middle East. They were basically looking at this and saying, okay, let's not argue about should it be or should it not be. Let's look at it, this is the reality. There's one state, it controls the whole thing, and so let's start with that base and then move forward. But we have to recognize that the one-state solution, even before October 7th, there was no political will on the American side to push the Israelis towards that. There were arguments among some in the Palestinian national movement to move towards that. That is, to have the younger generation of Palestinians simply give up on the PA, look to Tel Aviv and say, I like your basketball teams, I want to go to school there, let me vote. Right? And some Palestinians reject that because they believe that they would immediately be third-class citizens in a state like that. So I think at this level, it's fair to look at why our politicians cling to a two-state solution, because I do think it serves these short-term interests. But we also have to be pretty realistic that within these two societies, especially now, I mean, how in the world are you going to get, let's set aside someone like Netanyahu, but how are you going to get a Palestinian, not even a Hamas representative, how are you going to get a Palestinian to sit down with someone who commanded the Israeli military in Gaza? Well, under what conditions would that happen? I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, this is part of what we're not grasping is going on in Palestinian society, right? So I'm not sure, if one state is even viable at this point. But I think having the conversation in the U.S. is useful because it gets our political elite to open the agenda up more and think more imaginatively about ways to have security for both of these people.
So sort of a follow-up in Son's question. So I have the impression, and you can fill me in if it's accurate or not, that what October 7th did in Israel is shatter the illusion of safety and security and protection completely. And one of the groups I've been listening to is called Standing Together. It's Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis, mostly young from what I can tell, they're 20 years old as an organization, who say the only solution for peace and security for all of us is to figure out how to share the land together. And so what I was wondering is what's going on in Israel right now in regards to this shattering of this illusion of safety that they don't have. What's been the impact on Israel? Again, it's a small group, but what do you think up the road with younger people saying everything that's been happening, it doesn't work, let's figure this out? You know, you talked about I don't have the right language, but the head of the military that attacked Gaza. Well, you know, Netanyahu may well be voted out and some of those people may well go with him, right? And so what do you see as a possibility for a movement in Israel of actually willing to share the land with their Palestinian siblings?
Yeah. Yeah, it makes me, like, it's so sad how far we've come, because there was, you know, you know, in the early 90s, late 80s, there really was a very significant constituency in Israel for making concessions, and that were willing to do things like, because as I said, Arafat, you know, no, we're not ever going to talk to him, right? So, you know, I think that was the reality. I mean, there was a significant part of the Israeli population that was willing to make concessions, and that valued a future in which this violence is, you know, is conclusively solved. Not all problems would be solved, but the violence would. And so where we are today, I think, is, you know, the complete, and I think this was in place before October 7th, but it's dead. That Israeli left is gone. My insight into Israeli politics is rather limited. I'm just going off from what I hear, you know, what observers are saying. And I think the other thing we have to recognize is that, yes, we can see in both cases shock, right? But what we're not realizing is that shock like this is not static. It produces things. You know, it moves societies in ways that can be unpredictable. And so I don't know. I don't know what it would take to have that sort of idea, because when you look at the public opinion polls in Israel, when it comes to Netanyahu's policies towards the Palestinians, that's not an issue of disagreement, right? I mean, the problems are the way he deals with the hostages, or the corruption charges, or the judiciary. Most of the opinion polls of Israeli Jews are very supportive of the idea of complete destruction and whatever, you know, that may take. Maybe parts of the Israeli body politic are not well informed. I think you could say that about the U.S. during the Iraq invasion. On my own campus, I have a couple of students who worked in Israel with peace organizations, and they're trying hard on campus, and it's extremely difficult. But I'm aware of those efforts. I mean, what do you think would be attainable in like what would be reasonable to attain in those types of discussions? Like, what type of baseline agreement would be attainable? I hate to turn the questions on you, but I mean, this is something I don't know much about. But.
Right, well, and I don't either, that's why I'm here, but so what Netanyahu has, to me, done, his logic is absolutely, what's the right word? It's completely nonsense. You will never get rid of people wanting to have their freedom and liberation, wanting to connect with their land. You will never get rid of that desire. And what he has done is create a whole new generation of trauma and anger and hatred and resentment. And so that's what he has done. But I don't know, maybe this is my idealism, but I've been on one Zoom call with these amazing young people in Israel, Arab and Jewish, who are working together, even in the midst of the worst possible scenario. You know, and they're fighting to make sure their friends get to stay in school, that their Palestinian friends aren't thrown out of university because they say ceasefire in their Facebook page. But they are showing up, and they're young. Yeah. And it's old folks, frankly, these older folks that are very stuck in an old way of viewing Israel. And there's I don't know, that's where I think the solution is one state, figuring out how to share it, because everything's going to go to hell in a handbasket if they don't. And I don't know if hope's the right word, but my thought with my question was, my impression again was that a lot of Israeli people experienced a trauma and that they had never thought they'd experience on October 7th, right? And that maybe for some of those folks, they realize you cannot ignore the freedom and the hope and the aspirations of a whole people and not expect something to happen. I think the veneer's been ripped off of the fallacy that everything's going to be business as usual ever again. So I guess I'm wondering, back to my question, back to you.
No, it could. I mean, yeah, I think like you could see a way where that type of shock could lead, you know, to a point where, yeah, like we really gotta, you know, like Northern Ireland, or, you know, and this is sad because political scientists look at this as sort of like a laboratory, but there are measurements of like trauma, and like you could get to this level of killing and then you're gonna have to change, you know, like World War I, World War II. So yeah, but I think that they're not gonna get there on their own, right? And I think part of the problem is that it's really hard to see what part of the American thing elites in that part of the Israeli establishment that Netanyahu represents, like who are they listening to? Like what affects them as to who's talking over here? Like, so Netanyahu made a speech yesterday about American campuses and, you know, referenced 1930 Germany and stuff like that. I mean, that's not real. He's just talking to, it's just red meat for, he's not making that speech to the US. He's not that stupid. But who is he listening to in the US? Because I think that kind of movement in Israeli society is going to need a lot of help, right? And if the view in Israel is that they really are isolated, that the Europeans will cut them off in a second, you know, they don't trust the Europeans, and really it's the Americans are really the only ones, then the U.S. is in a good position to affect it. But I don't know who they listen to. It's very strange. I mean, Ron Dermer, you know, who was one of his sort of close advisors, came to Case Western Reserve. I don't know why he was here. I mean, why is he here? So that's another thing, like, who are they talking to? I don't know.
It's a two-part question. The first part is the nuclear option, and in Dimona is the location of the Israeli nuclear reactor, and for all we know, Iran may have that option. It was 97% enriched the last I heard. So that's the first question. Is there any remote chance that a nuclear option could be used? We don't know what other countries in that part of the world also have that option. The second part of the question is, in the last week or so, there's been a lot of uprising on campuses on this particular issue, and it's engulfing the administration, the students, freedom of speech, discrimination issues. It's a multifaceted problem, and what do you see that as a precursor to some of the uprisings that occurred in the Vietnam War as a parallel?
Yeah, two very good questions. So the first one, the nuclear one, no, I don't think in this particular conflict see a nuclear weapon used. I mean, the U.S. military controls all that airspace. So I hope we got our eyes on those things. The other part of that I thought you were going to is, yeah, there are a number of scholars now with thinking about Iran and think that now we are in a situation where we can't expect the Iranian regime to get a weapon, because what's started to happen now with this breakdown, I don't think there really ever was deterrence between Iran and Israel, but the demonstrative part of what we've seen, this sort of orchestrated missile sort of attack and then the Israelis secretly attacking, a threshold has been crossed now in that sense, and there is a strong speculation now that, you know, whether it was that the Iranians now are not going to do a nuclear deal because they don't trust the U.S., or it's this, or a mix, or, you know, domestic hardliners in Iran that are basically doing, you know, in 1996 Netanyahu, I told you so, you can't trust the Americans. Why are you signing these deals? We need nuclear weapons. So I think that's a very ominous possibility, and I just leave it at that, yeah. Yeah, campuses, look, this is more than just Israel-Palestine, but I think it's at the core, and I'll try to be brief. Look, our universities, they're one of the most successful things that this country has built and offers to the world, right? And I'm very fortunate to have this job. I'm very, very fortunate. I love teaching. And I love being on a university campus. But we have to recognize that universities are more than just faculty and students. And so really over the last decade, this term neoliberal university, I think, is a good way to think about it, because it's this weird amalgamation. On the one hand, you have university administrators that have just been, and all you got to do is just go on any university and look for their mission statement. What do they say they want their students to do? They want them to be global citizens. They want them to have a concept of justice. They want them to be, you know, think critically, act locally, be involved in the community. Right? These are all things my university values. We've put institutions in place, not diversity, equity, and inclusion, not just them. We have an Institute of Social Justice. We have the Fowler Center for Business in the Pursuit of the Good World, or something like this. So you've got a university which has been, if you want to call this identity politics, you want to call it woke politics, whatever. I have my, you know, my own sort of debates with it, but it's very clear that's where our university's been going. They've been like, look, and my Case Western Reserve, when I came there, more than 50% of our students from Ohio. So one of the early things the administration said was, we want more students, we want more diversity, we want them, and not only that, we want international students, and we say it, we go, 19% of our students, we're fudging a little bit because we're including graduate students, right? And they're advertising it to undergrads. It's a little secret. But we do that, right? We push global education, right? So you've had that whole effort, but then less visible, unless you've been paying attention to buildings and things like that. Universities, the private ones, I mean the public ones, have seen their budgets cut, and how are they replacing it? Private money. And then a place like my university, the privates, we're all about the private money, right? We've got to get that donor money in, right? Now we also need student tuition. This is the two halves of this thing. So we have built a system where we have donors, and they make these donations tax-free, but it's very clear that they're consuming something. We call it prestige, access, whatever you want to call it. They're consuming something, but they get a tax break for it. And now what we've got is this massive mess that is hitting. And you have a generation of students that have been fed all this, been told about all of this, about human rights, and that we're up here, and yet they're hitting the reality of, you know, sort of the American financial system and how we finance our higher education. And so some of these donors may have very narrow political views about Israel-Palestine. But for instance, in the case of UPenn, those donors, this was more about, and this is from my colleagues, is that this was more about an exercise in power. Like, whose university do you think this is? You know, the president of the university should not go placate these kids, because we're the future, not them. And so we're seeing this. What's going to give? I don't know. But, you know, now I agree, it's not at Kent State. It's not at Cleveland State. And I think there are reasons why some of our and these are universities that have also been financially immiserated because of the state, right? So you've seen a lot of stuff pulled out. So we're not saying, it's not Vietnam in the sense of scope, but it is Vietnam in the sense of scale, right? Like the first time you're seeing, National Guard, Texas, NYPD, first time. And the other element is, not only is this the generation of students that were fed all this and told all this, these institutions where this is happening, if you start, and you can tell this, when the New York Times starts writing about where these kids are from, it's hitting the backyard, right? These are the kids of the best and the brightest. These are the wealthy kids. So, that's also different than Vietnam. But yeah, I think what's happening is a real tragedy. It is an issue of academic freedom and free speech. It is true that some students do feel uncomfortable. That's not the same as being unsafe, okay? There are students that have been unsafe, right? I think some of this has been exaggerated. It's particularly exaggerated in Congress. And they constantly repeat falsehoods, either about things that happened on October 7th, and they repeat falsehoods of what's happening on campus. And so I think that we're going to see where this goes. And students have, the next couple weeks can be real difficult. Like, I would not want to be, the president of my university has a cop that follows him around. Really. And this is the level at which he thinks, I don't know if he's really afraid or it's showing off or something, I don't know what, but it sends a bad signal. I don't get to walk into his office, but other faculty that walk in there are wondering why he's being followed around by a Cleveland uniformed officer.
So, Professor, we'll do a continuation with this, is to define to us clearly what is anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitic. Because the media is confused and our politicians are completely confused. They're using them all interchangeably, and yet they're calling these young people confused.
Yeah, so part of what's going on is there is a definition called the International Holocaust Remembrance Center, the IHRC. About 6 or 7 years ago, they created a definition. The definition itself is not problematical, and straight up anti-Semitism, animus towards the entire Jewish group as a group of people. That's not a problematic definition, but what the IHRC did was they released this definition and they attached a list of examples, like 20. And a lot of these examples, not all of them, but a lot of them do focus on so to quote it, unfair criticism of the state of Israel, right? Singling out or demonizing the state of Israel. The problem is these terms are extremely vague, and they were put purposefully in the examples section because no one could agree on anything else besides the core definition. There's also a political part of this, which is within the U.S. Department of Education, a guy named Keith Marcus, I think it's Marcus, yeah. He was instrumental in getting this definition because the objective was to have this then rolled into federal laws around universities so that discrimination could be extended, because you can discriminate on religion. I grew up Catholic. I always wanted to go to the University of Notre Dame, right? And so you can discriminate on religion, right? But the idea was to have the loophole create an ethnic status for Jews, so that then you could go after them. So to bring all that together, the problem is this particular definition. There is another definition called the Jerusalem Declaration, and there's others that are used to say you don't need these, but that's at the core of what's going on. And so it makes it much easier for people like the president of my university, which he did this last year. He equated the students' vote for divestment in the state of Israel with he called them anti-Semite. He called what they did anti-Semitic. Those silly students took that to be that they were anti-Semitic, right? But yeah, I think this is and my association, the Middle East Studies Association, if you're interested, we have a website called Go Into Advocacy. You can see all the letters that we write sternly worded letters to universities. And you can see all the cases. And we are very, very consistent that anti-Semitism is not the equivalent of anti-Zionism, right? And that back to what I started with, we teach Zionism as a form of nationalism. I understand, and I've had students that are emotionally upset. I had a student on Monday after October 7th in my international relations course. I raised the issue because we were talking about war in the Middle East, how apropos, and he said, I don't want to talk about it. Right? That's what we have to deal with. I had 35 students. He's like, I don't want to talk about this. What do you do? It's tough. No one told me how to handle that in grad school. You have to recognize, I recognize students can be upset, right? They can be upset if you criticize them, upset about what's happening. He was upset because he knew, he's like, after this attack, there's going to be more anti-Semitism. And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right, right? But stopping conversation, right? Saying, no, you can't talk about that, right? You're overstepping your bounds when you criticize. When you engage in this political debate, you step, I think that's wrong, and I think that's a cover, and it's been used by many people. I think some people are sincere in it. They are misinformed, or they're deeply attached to the state of Israel in a religious sense. I respect that. But I think political elites have been using it as a weapon to silence political opinion they don't like. Is there speech that crosses the line? Yeah, there's speech that I've seen it. I saw it at Kent State a decade ago when I was in a room with my colleague, and there was another guy, and he flipped out and started screaming at Israelis and throwing pictures in the room and all sorts of stuff, right? But we have, one of our bedrock principles is we're supposed to be as close to free speech absolutists as we can all, be. Me personally, yeah, I think there's lines you don't cross, and I wouldn't support speech like that. But in the vast majority of cases on American campuses, that is not what is going on, not at all.
Next question.
Hi, thank you very much for this. Can you elaborate a little bit on the role of the United Nations agency, UNRWA, and why the funding is a big part in how it impacts the Palestinians? That was one question. The other question I had is, some people mentioned AIPAC. I just read that the Mossad has, the Secret Service of the Mossad is sending social media threats actually to United States citizens. We have facial vision or pictures and recognition, and we will, if you protest with these protesters, we will make sure that you don't have any jobs opportunity. Yeah. My question to you is, when will the rights of the United States come before the Israelis? How are they allowed to come into a different country and to do this to American citizens?
Yeah. Well, it's not working. It's not, like if you could just see how my students are talking right now, how they're talking about their form of protest, there's no fear, folks. I mean, and I've seen this. I mean, I started, the first SJP was at Case Western Reserve in 2008. His name was Rami, and he's West Side, Arab kid, great. He's got a good dental practice in Columbus. And he started that thing. He was a special student, right? And then afterwards, other students wanted to do it and were very afraid. I had some students that wanted to do it, but they didn't want to call it Students for Palestine. They wanted to call it something else. Today, we got students, foreign students involved. I got students from Sandusky. I got athletes. I'm not going to talk about identity. I don't like who's this and what but this is multi-ethnic, folks. This is, and not, Case is a small one, we're just a little lens. So just on that point about whatever AIPAC is doing, they are so far behind the ball, I mean, you're right. I think if this is what's going on, there are real legal implications. But as its effect on what's going on in the U.S., that's tiddlywinks in a sense. UNRWA is a good question. I did my first internship because I went to this military school. I did graduate, but I had a problem and I had to leave for a while. I went to school overseas, and I actually interned at UNRWA when it was located in Vienna. And that's how I actually became interested, because I wanted an internship like all college kids do, and I didn't care what it was. I just knew it was at the UN. And so I learned about Palestine sort of and what UNRWA did by being in their comm office. So this is a long strategy. So the Israelis wanted, and this is also peculiar, it goes back to my uplifting versus the coercive part. UNRWA was put in place by the Americans to help manage that problem that I started out with these refugees trying to go back home. How can we stop them from going back home? Okay, shoot them at the border. That's not so good. Why don't you create a special UN agency to manage them? And it is one of the most successful UN agencies, because when you look at the social status of Palestinians in the late 40s, early 50s, compare it to the late 80s, it is UNRWA schooling that is the most important thing for the education of generations of Palestinians. So first, full stop, UNRWA is one of the most successful UN agencies. But in this new Israeli sort of policy towards the Palestinians, the objective has been, how can we pull out refugee status so as to stop the oversight? Because there's so many UN agencies, once you have status as a refugee, there's things coming left and right in Palestine, right? And it's a very highly NGOized area of the world. And so there has been this sort of utopian belief among Israeli elites that what we can do, so in the UN, refugee status is passed on. That's institutional legality, right? However, the UNHCR, which is responsible for global, they're a little bit lighter on this. So over the years, they've been a little, it's not that they haven't enforced it, they've just been lax. So numbers of Afghani refugees, for instance, going all the way back to the Soviet Union, the numbers have been whittling down, right? And it's just, there's this belief, basically, that UNRWA is on its game, and they track the refugees, they keep them, and so that's the idea, they're generations of refugees. The Israelis have this hope that if they can destroy UNRWA and transfer the Palestinian file to the UNHCR, it will make it a lot easier to start pulling back on this many number of refugees. Do you understand what I'm saying? But it's a real pie in the sky thing, because you already see what's happened. The minute they filed those charges that some UNRWA employees were Hamas, and then you saw the money cut back. It took Blinken 4 days till someone, whispered in his ear, you do know that 80% of all the humanitarian aid going in is run by them, and we can't get anything in without them. And so then they immediately started backtracking. So I think that's the strategy, but I don't think it's viable. And besides, from the American and European perspective, this is the only thing that keeps, starving Palestinians from jumping over an Egyptian military wall.
Do we have questions in front, or?
Yeah. So I love the questions coming from the audience, and thank you for all the education I've had. But I just had one question that I still haven't figured out. Why do we depend on Israel for our defense? What I hear is that their Secret Service gives us a lot of, why do we pay money? Why, the Israel lobby?
Yeah, the big question, yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to give you my Introduction to Middle East Politics. All right, so this is a debate on which actually there's a lot of literature. So some of you have already mentioned it. So one argument, so the question is, what explains this extraordinary relationship? The U.S.-Israeli relationship, the extraordinary part of it starts in '67. So it's newer, It is extraordinary in comparison to any other American relationship. So you could look at, for a short period, the American-Filipino relationship was like this, during Vietnam, U.S.-South Korea. There's periods where you see similarities, but the length of this relationship is unique. So that's one thing. So the question is, why is that, right? What explains this unique thing? So one argument is this thing called the Israel lobby. This is looking in U.S., and this was written by two very prominent political scientists that basically looked inside American society and says this policy that the U.S. has vis-a-vis Israel and the broader Middle East makes no sense in American national security interest, so why? And their argument was, it's the politics of this lobby organization, the institutions of Congress, media, a variety of things. That's one argument. an argument that has a little bit older, a little bit more lineage to it, does sort of come from early American Israeli leaders. This is the Joe Biden argument, that Israel and the United States are unique, the only democracy in the Middle East, the exceptional democracy in the globe. We share values, right? And there are many, this is regurgitated constantly. But I think it's best it's Biden, if you take Biden, the way he approaches this. I think that's a strong argument, and you can support that argument with opinion polling, like favorability rates, where the United States generally has favorable views of Israel. So you got lobby, shared values. The third one is one you hinted at, which is that from the American sort of foreign policy, military, could care less about the Bible, could care less about values, all that kind of stuff. This is a strategic relationship, right? And this is an argument that came in the 50s and 60s, really the 70s, where either the Israeli military was seen as so skilled, we wanted to be like them, or the Mossad delivered value to the United States, or in the Cold War, Israel was a very good bastion against the Soviet Union. So you got lobby, values, and then this strategic argument. And then the fourth argument would be like the Noam Chomsky's of the world that says, no, see, Israel is useful to the US because it's useful for American empire. This is not Israel running the US. This is American empire. And we need a country like Israel in that part of the world that is both capable, militarily capable, but also keeps our enemies off balance. The values argument sort of is static, right? It assumes, right? The strategic argument was really more valuable during the Cold War, less valuable today, especially when the United States is shooting down all these missiles and things like that. The empire argument has, some virtues to it, but you can look at it right now and go, if Israel is useful for American empire, what's it getting us? What are we getting out of this? So I think each of these arguments has some accuracy to it, but they're a little lumpy, and it sort of depends on what part of the American population you're talking about. I deal a lot with the U.S. military, given my current research. I'm doing stuff on military politics in the Arab world. And their view of this is quite fascinating. They really do see this as like a military mission, and they stringently don't want to have views on the Israeli military, whereas they will talk freely about the Egyptian military, the Jordanian military. When it comes to the Israelis, this is something that they, so I think those four areas, it's some sort of mix. But this is the current moment we're in, and the aftermath of this is really going to test all of these arguments, right? Is it values? Is it this? The lobby, we may see the power of the lobby in these elections. We'll see.
We're going to have one more question, and then we'll wrap things up.
So I'm trying to understand some of the wording in all of this, and I think that's the wording in all of this, right? So I think that's some of the biggest problems that we face, American Palestinian, and I think the biggest issue is these words of Israel is a democracy. Is it a democracy when there are laws that say that Israel is only a Jewish state? So is it a theocracy, right? So I think the problem always stems from the fact that we want Israel to be something in this country. Our government wants Israel to be something. So they kind of throw a lot of words out there that, there are the only democracy in the Middle East, and so that's why we need to support them. And we're dealing with so much double standards that it is hard to be able to kind of see through all of the fog. Like I can see through the fog because I've lived there, I've been there, I have my own story. But it's hard, I can imagine, seeing what the news, just the general news says. Again, like you said, the repetitive lies, the 40 beheaded babies, the things that just help. Our own president is passing on conversation that hasn't been, verified, but when journalists over and over again ask our governments to, investigate the burial site of 200, buried just recently, yesterday. There's no follow-up. There's nobody that's willing to do that. I'm struggling with the double standards. I'm struggling with, passing this information on to my children now, my teenagers, of, why is it okay for, Rashida Tlaib to be censored because she said, from the river to the sea, but there's Max Miller and other people saying, kill them all. And nothing is said about that.
Right.
So how, as a love of being American and love of being Palestinian, how do I sift through all of this and have these conversations? Because I want to have those conversations. I want to be here. I want to be able to talk to other fellow Americans, but I have to be calm and collective, and I have to sit quietly and hear you talk about, something I've experienced. I've experienced all of the racist ways that we are dealt with when we have to set foot there in that country. And I have to calmly hear somebody talk about our history, and and I appreciate actually how well you've sifted through the difficult, the landmines of like making sure you don't say certain things, but why can't we start saying these things? Why can't we talk about the extreme Zionism that causes Netanyahu and the rest of their government to say they will never have a two-state solution? They will never allow it because of the fact that they have this extreme belief that there should be no Palestinians in their state. And it is a fact. It's law. Like, there are things there that are in black and white written, and somehow we're still not in America allowed to talk about it. So what is your advice to your students? I mean, I feel like I'm still struggling. What are you saying to your students that, you're saying there's a Jewish student that is sensitive and feels like they don't want to talk about it? It's time. We have to have these conversations. We have to clear the way and get rid of the poison that has been placed for decades and decades, so that we can hope for peace. We all want it. We want that peace to exist.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I mean, I think we have to recognize that in this country right now, there's a structure of power in which some people can talk about this and other people can't, right? And the best, classic example, the valedictorian of the University of Southern California, but this is sort of the way, when I started doing events like this in Cleveland and 2005, 6, 7, and the way I would talk about it is that this is very American. This is very American. If we just think a little bit, a system of power that allows some people to talk about things that other people are not allowed to talk about, or the question of democracy. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and we were a democracy in the 50s and 40s and 30s and we were I mean, look, can you compare African Americans to Palestinians in Israel right now, 1-to-1? No. Are they part of a universe in which you can compare and contrast? Yeah. Is there an African American movement that has been working for a very long time in trying to forge bonds of solidarity, and what we're seeing right now that is really exploding? So I usually talk in terms of, this is not something that's alien. That's actually very American. We do that a lot, and we've done it in our history. And when we talk about things like democracy, we're pretty good at that too. We know democracy for what? For whom? I had a great, my family grew up in Georgia. I had a great democracy up until the 1960s. I mean, so it's democracy for who? And what do we want democracy to be? Is it just a thing that we get? Is it just a switch? You're democratic or you're not. Of course that's not true, right? So that's usually how I think about it. And I think our students are very well aware, and I think this younger generation is very well aware of that power dynamic, but yet they know they have an opportunity and they're going to push it as far as they can. It's hard to, sometimes it's real easy after events like this to then look at movements like Black Lives Matter or whatever and go, well, you didn't have a plan, you weren't well organized, you didn't have good leadership. That's all true, and I think, but at the same time, that's not how social movements succeed. That's not how the civil rights movement, it wasn't just like this unfolding easy logic. You had different views in the African American community, like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King, others, and those disputes continue, right? So, yeah, I think it's good. I think the best thing is just to be really, really clear-headed, right? And one of the things that I find about our students in this generation is they are not ideal. They're idealistic, but like how they go about this is very deliberate. Can we do a USC and still expect the same students to apply next year? USC can, maybe. Stanford can. Can we? I don't know. They're worried about that. Our students know that. All that stuff I just explained to you, they knew that. So I guess I want to end on an optimistic note because, like I said, this is a solution that does have a problem. It's going to require a lot more political will than we currently have. And, you know, one of the things about solidarity is that it's unequal, right? Like the sacrifice that a Case Western Reserve student faces is not at all like the sacrifice someone in Gaza or Tulkarm or Nazareth faces, right? And so that's what I would say. You know, don't be realistic. Eye on the ground, you know, don't look too much up in the sky because that's how things changed in this country. It didn't change because like white people like me in Atlanta said, oh, it's really bad, maybe we should let these people in. No, it changed because we were forced to, you know.
There's a lot of those young people going down south and, you know, with those voter drives. That's kind of where I was going after my question.
I know, I teach this great article by Doug McAdam, it's called Freedom Summer. And he does this really cool thing where he looks at the students that went to Ohio University that went south. It's this really cool sort of sociological thing with like, he's able to take these groups. It's very kind of in the weeds methods thing, but when my students read it, and this is why this sociologist wrote it, it's literally a roadmap to how you build cross-cutting alliances on campus. You know? How you get these movements and stuff like that. So I just find it deeply subversive.
Give us a copy of that.
Yeah, it's a great article, but it's just, again, this example about this is what the university is supposed to do, and the administration is complaining about it. So.
Right, before I let my good friend Isam here bring us home, I do want to say thank you to everybody for coming out tonight. I hope that you understand that this is your public library and that this forum was possible because you all value a public library, and we were able to have this conversation tonight, a civil conversation about tough things, and I appreciate that there's some things that weren't said and maybe need to be said, but the fact that we were able to come together tonight and hear and learn from a fantastic presentation and have conversation. Thank you all for that. It makes me proud to be part of this community, and I'm very grateful for you all to come out tonight. And Isam, bring us home.
I want to give you a little bit of secret. My daughter had instigated all of this right there in Nadia. But I came and actually spoke to Andrew, and I said, Andrew, you know, I'm by the way, an American, I was Syrian descent. I've been in this country for over 54 years, and I have seen how the country how not spoken about the real stuff, about the dilemma of the Palestinians for many, many years. And I know that the media doesn't give you enough information for you to know what really is going on. So when I came and spoke to Andrew, I was also concerned. Last night I was really concerned about what would happen today in here. But I'm very honored and be honest, so pleased that we have a civil conversation in which we educate each other, right? Because this information is not going to hear it from the media. You're going to only hear it as if we are forcing ourselves to have this difficult conversation. So I'm very grateful for your presence. Please teach, learn, study, read books. There are a lot of books in the library that can help you. And there is a website that I would like to recommend that each one of you should really easily access to it. It's ifamericans.org. ifamericans.org. This is a lady who's a journalist that left her work in California and went to Palestine, Israel. And she realized what's going on. So she came back and dedicated her life to defending and speaking the truth. So we don't get the noise that covers the truth. I'm very grateful for Andrew for allowing us to be in this forum. I'm so grateful for Pete for having to accept our invitation, and may God help us lead to peace in the future. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.